The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty Atlanta roads as Alex Thompson drove home from his late-night shift at the tech consulting firm. His dark blue Honda Civic hummed quietly through the peaceful suburban streets. It had been a long day of helping clients with their E2 security systems, or at least that's what everyone thought he did. Rain started to sprinkle against his windshield as he noticed the red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. Alex checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. With a quiet sigh, he pulled over to the curb, following all the proper procedures he knew so well. Turn off the engine, hands visible on the steering wheel, interior lights on. 2 officers approached his car, one on each side. The taller one, who introduced himself as Detective Baker, asked for his license and registration. Alex noticed how the detective's partner kept his hand near his holster, despite Alex's calm and cooperative demeanor. "Do you know why we pulled you over tonight, sir?" Detective Baker's flashlight beam swept across the car's interior. "No, sir, I don't," Alex replied politely, maintaining eye contact through the side mirror. "Your left taillight's out," said Baker, though Alex knew that wasn't true. He'd just had his car serviced last week. What happened next felt like a carefully choreographed dance. The officers asked him to step out of the car. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through Alex's navy blue suit jacket as he stood by the roadside. They said they needed to search his vehicle due to suspicious behavior, though Alex had done nothing but comply with their every request. The scene grew tenser as Detective Baker's partner called out from the passenger side of Alex's car. "Got something here." His voice carried a note of triumph that made Alex's stomach turn. The officer emerged holding a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be drugs. Alex's mind raced. He knew with absolute certainty that bag hadn't been in his car minutes ago. He watched, keeping his expression neutral, as the officers exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't random. This was a setup. "Sir, would you like to explain what this is?" Detective Baker held up the bag, his flashlight illuminating its contents. "That's not mine," Alex stated calmly, though his heart was pounding. "I've never seen it before." The cold handcuffs clicked around his wrists as rain dripped down his face. As they read him his rights, Alex noticed a small detail. Detective Baker's body camera light wasn't blinking. It should have been recording, but it wasn't. The drive to the police station was quiet, broken only by the sound of rain against the patrol car's roof and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Alex sat in the back, his mind working through scenarios, weighing options. He could reveal who he really was, but that would compromise years of careful work. Lives could be put at risk. No, he had to play this smart. At the station, Alex was processed like any other suspect. Fingerprints, mugshot, personal belongings catalogued and stored away. The holding cell was cold and smelled of cleaning products. As he sat on the hard bench, watching other detainees come and go, he couldn't help but notice how Detective Baker and his partner huddled with other officers, glancing his way occasionally, their satisfaction barely concealed. A young public defender arrived hours later, looking overwhelmed and clutching a stack of files. "Mr. Thompson, I'll be representing you in this matter." Her voice wavered slightly as she flipped through his preliminary paperwork. Alex just nodded, knowing this was just the beginning. What these officers didn't realize was that they hadn't just arrested a random IT consultant, they'd walked straight into something much bigger than they could imagine. But for now, all he could do was wait and watch as their carefully constructed trap seemed to spring perfectly into place. The local news would soon pick up the story: successful drug bust in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Another criminal off the streets. But beneath this simple headline lay a web of corruption, deception, and secrets that would soon turn this entire case upside down. For now, though, Alex Thompson sat quietly in his cell, playing the role of a wrongly accused man, which, ironically, wasn't entirely an act. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the county jail as Alex Thompson adjusted to his new reality. 3 days had passed since his arrest, and things were getting worse by the hour. He sat on the thin mattress of his cell, listening to the constant background noise of doors closing and guards talking. His public defender, Ms. Wilson, visited again that morning, looking more worried than before. She spread several papers across the small metal table in the meeting room. "They're building quite a case," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. Anonymous tips have been pouring in about your supposed involvement in local drug operations. Alex leaned forward, scanning the documents. His eyes stopped at his bank statements, statements he'd never seen before. "These aren't mine," he said quietly, pointing to several large deposits highlighted in yellow. "These records are fake." Ms. Wilson sighed, shuffling the papers. "The prosecution claims these deposits match patterns typical of drug money laundering. They've even got surveillance photos of you supposedly meeting with known dealers." She pulled out grainy photographs that showed someone who looked like Alex talking to various people on street corners. "Those pictures aren't what they seem," Alex insisted, knowing full well they'd been manipulated. He recognized the clothing he was wearing in them, from genuine surveillance photos taken during his actual undercover work, now twisted to serve a different purpose. Back in his cell, Alex watched the local news on the small common area TV. Detective Baker was giving an interview, standing proud in his pressed uniform. "This arrest is part of our ongoing effort to keep our streets safe," he declared to the cameras. "Our department has a strong track record of getting drug dealers off our streets." The other inmates started paying more attention to Alex after the news story aired. He could feel their eyes on him, hear their whispered conversations. Some thought he was a big-time dealer, others suspected he was just another victim of the system. Alex kept to himself, watching and waiting. Later that week, more evidence mysteriously appeared. A neighbor suddenly remembered seeing suspicious late-night visitors at Alex's apartment. His internet search history supposedly showed research into drug prices and transportation routes, all fabricated, of course. The frame job was thorough, professional even. Ms. Wilson tried her best to fight back. "Look at his record," she argued during a preliminary hearing. "Clean as a whistle. Steady job, pays his taxes, volunteers at the local food bank." But the prosecutor had a counter for everything. Those were just covers, they claimed. Common tactics used by sophisticated criminals. Detective Baker and his partner, Officer Reynolds, seemed to be everywhere. They sat in on every hearing, added new evidence to the file almost daily, and kept appearing on local news channels. "This case shows how well organized these criminals can be," Baker would say, his badge gleaming under the studio lights. "They hide in plain sight, pretending to be ordinary citizens." The walls felt like they were closing in. Alex's co-workers at the tech firm were interviewed. Some, under pressure, remembered strange phone calls and mysterious meetings. His company put him on indefinite leave. His apartment lease was terminated. His life was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. One evening, as Alex lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, he overheard two guards talking outside his cell. Baker and Reynolds sure got this one locked down tight, one said. "Their conviction rate is incredible this year." "Yeah," the other replied, "but have you noticed it's always the same type of arrests? Same setup, same evidence patterns." The guard's voice trailed off as they walked away, leaving Alex to ponder their words. Ms. Wilson visited again, looking exhausted. "They're offering a plea deal," she said, not meeting his eyes. 5 years instead of 20. "They say the evidence is overwhelming." She paused, fidgeting with her pen. "Maybe we should consider it." But Alex knew he couldn't take that deal. Not just because he was innocent, but because accepting it would derail years of crucial intelligence work. He had to trust that the truth would come out, that someone would start noticing the patterns, the inconsistencies. As he watched another sunset through the narrow jail window, Alex thought about Detective Baker and Officer Reynolds. They were good at what they did, maybe too good. They'd built what looked like a perfect case against him. But perfect things often draw attention, and attention was the last thing these corrupt officers wanted. In the distance, unknown to everyone involved, the first threads of their carefully woven plot were about to unravel. Someone had started asking questions, noticing patterns, and digging deeper into the remarkable success rate of these two particular officers. The frame might have been perfect, but perfect things tend to raise suspicions in those who know where to look. Detective Linda Parker from Internal Affairs stared at her office wall, now covered with photos, timelines, and sticky notes. Something about the Thompson case didn't sit right with her. She'd been reviewing body camera footage for 3 straight days, and the more she watched, the more her suspicions grew. "Look at this," she said to her partner, pointing to her computer screen. They were reviewing footage from Detective Baker's body cam during Thompson's arrest. The timestamp jumps here, just 2 seconds, but it's there. She clicked through several more clips, and here, always at crucial moments. Her partner leaned closer to the screen, frowning. Could be equipment malfunction. Linda shook her head, pulling up a spreadsheet. I've checked Baker and Reynolds' arrest records for the past 18 months. 68 arrests, 65 convictions. That's an unusually high success rate. And look at the pattern. All their evidence comes together the same way. Anonymous tips, surveillance photos, bank records. The office hummed with the sound of computers and distant conversations as Linda dug deeper. She'd started this investigation because of a routine review, but now she was finding connections that couldn't be ignored. She pulled up the surveillance photos from Thompson's case file. Something about them bothered her. Loading them into an image analysis program, she noticed subtle inconsistencies in the lighting and shadows. These photos had been altered professionally, but not perfectly. Late that evening, as most of the department headed home, Linda stayed, reviewing old case files. Each successful conviction by Baker and Reynolds followed the same script: too perfect, too clean. Real police work was messier, had loose ends. The next morning, she visited the evidence locker. I need to see the drug sample from the Thompson case, she told the clerk. Examining the sealed bag, she noticed something interesting. The evidence tag number sequence didn't quite match the department's usual pattern. Back at her desk, Linda started mapping connections on her computer. Baker and Reynolds had worked together for 3 years. Their conviction rate started climbing about 6 months after they partnered up. The types of cases changed too: bigger busts, higher profile arrests. You should see this, her partner called from his desk. He'd been checking their financial records. Nothing obvious in their bank accounts, but Reynolds bought a boat last year. Cash purchase. Baker's kid just started at a private school. Linda rubbed her tired eyes. They're careful. Too careful. She started cross-referencing their arrests with other ongoing investigations. A pattern emerged. Their drug busts often interfered with larger federal investigations in the area. Cases that were building towards bigger targets suddenly fell apart when Baker and Reynolds made their arrests. She decided to interview some of their previous suspects. Most wouldn't talk, but one did. They knew things, the former suspect told her in the prison visiting room. Things they couldn't have known unless... He stopped, looking nervous. Look, I've said too much already. Linda also discovered that Officer Reynolds had requested specific patrol areas, neighborhoods that, according to federal crime statistics, were hot spots for international drug trafficking. But instead of building cases against the big players, they were picking off smaller targets, or people who appeared to be smaller targets. One evening, while reviewing more body cam footage, Linda noticed something odd. During Thompson's arrest, Baker's phone lit up with a text message. The frame was blurry, but she could make out part of an area code, one from outside the state. She started tracking their patrol patterns, overlaying them with reported drug activity. The officers seemed to know exactly where to be and, more importantly, where not to be. It was as if they had inside information about which areas to avoid. Look at this, she told her supervisor, spreading out her findings. Their arrests always happen just before major federal operations in the area. They're either incredibly lucky or... Her supervisor studied the evidence carefully. This is good work, but we need more. Keep digging, but keep it quiet. If what you're suggesting is true... Linda understood. If Baker and Reynolds were really working with drug cartels, using their positions to disrupt investigations and frame innocent people, the implications were huge. This wasn't just about Thompson anymore, it was about the integrity of the entire department. As she drove home that night, Linda thought about Alex Thompson sitting in his cell. The pieces were starting to come together, but something was still missing. Why him? Out of all the possible targets, why choose someone with such a clean record? She didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question would blow the entire case wide open. The truth about Thompson's identity would change everything, but for now, she kept gathering evidence, building her case piece by piece, knowing that someone's freedom and the department's integrity hung in the balance. 200 miles away from the county jail where Alex Thompson sat, a secure conference room buzzed with tension. Director Phillips of the CIA's Domestic Operations Division studied the report in front of him, his expression growing darker with each page. "How long has Thompson been in custody?" he asked, looking up at the assembled team. 9 days, replied Agent Rodriguez, who'd been monitoring the situation. The local police have no idea who they've actually arrested. Thompson's cover is holding, but she paused, choosing her words carefully. Sir, this could compromise everything we've built over the past 2 years. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. On the wall-mounted screens, surveillance photos showed the complex web of international drug cartels they'd been tracking. Thompson had been their key operative, positioned perfectly within Atlanta's tech industry to monitor how these cartels were using legitimate businesses to hide their operations. Show me what we know about the arresting officers, Phillips ordered, pushing aside Thompson's file. New images appeared on the screens, Detective Baker and Officer Reynolds during various arrests. Agent Rodriguez pointed to several timestamps. Their arrest patterns are interesting. Every major bust they've made in the past year has interfered with our ongoing surveillance operations. At first, we thought it was coincidence. But now, Phillips prompted. Now we believe they're working for the Valencia cartel, she replied, pulling up more photos. They're identifying potential threats to the cartel's operations and eliminating them, either through arrests or intimidation. When they arrested Thompson, they might have actually been targeting him specifically, but not for the reasons they claimed. The director stood up, pacing the room. So either they know exactly who Thompson is, or they just got lucky, another agent finished. Either way, we have a serious problem. Meanwhile, in his jail cell, Thompson maintained his cover perfectly. He knew that revealing his true identity would not only compromise his mission, but potentially put dozens of other operatives at risk. The tech consulting firm where he worked wasn't just a cover, it was a vital monitoring post for tracking international money movements. Back in the conference room, Agent Rodriguez pulled up new data. The Valencia cartel has been trying to establish a stronger presence in Atlanta's tech sector. They're using software companies to launder money and create secure communication networks. Thompson was close to identifying their main operators when he was arrested. And these officers? Phillips asked, tapping Baker's photo on the screen. We've traced several offshore accounts linked to them. The deposits align perfectly with major cartel operations in the area. They're not just corrupt cops, they're sophisticated spotters for the cartel. The complexity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. They had an undercover operative in jail, dirty cops working for a cartel, and years of careful intelligence work hanging in the balance. There's more, Agent Rodriguez added, pulling up satellite images of various locations around Atlanta. We've identified several tech companies that are likely cartel fronts. Thompson had managed to map out their entire network. If his cover is blown, we lose access to all of this. The director studied the images thoughtfully. What about the internal affairs investigator? The one looking into Baker and Reynolds? Detective Parker, Rodriguez confirmed. She's good. She's starting to piece things together, but she doesn't have the full picture. She can't, without knowing about our operation. In his cell, Thompson kept playing his role perfectly. He complained about his situation to his public defender, expressed confusion about the evidence against him, and maintained the demeanor of an ordinary IT consultant caught in a nightmare. But underneath, his trained mind was working constantly, observing patterns, gathering information about the jail's routines, and noting every detail about Baker and Reynolds' visits. We have another problem, Agent Rodriguez said, pulling up new data. The cartel is planning something big. Our intelligence suggests they're about to launch a new money laundering platform using one of the tech companies Thompson was monitoring. If we pull him out now, we lose our best chance at stopping it. The director faced his team. Options? The room erupted in careful discussion. Some argued for extracting Thompson immediately, others for letting the case play out while maintaining surveillance. The stakes were enormous. Billions in drug money, international criminal networks, and the lives of numerous undercover operatives. As the sun set over Atlanta, 3 separate groups of people worked late into the night. In the CIA conference room, agents planned their next moves. In the Internal Affairs Office, Detective Parker added new pieces to her puzzle. And in his jail cell, Thompson waited patiently, knowing that sometimes the hardest part of any operation was simply staying in character when everything around you was falling apart. The morning of Alex Thompson's trial was approaching fast, and 3 different worlds were about to collide. In the CIA's operations center, Director Phillips stood before his team, the weight of the decision visible in his stance. "We've got 48 hours," he announced, pointing to the latest intelligence reports. "The Valencia cartel is moving their money through a new tech platform." Thompson's notes suggest it's happening through Greenlight Software, one of the companies he was investigating before his arrest. Agent Rodriguez interrupted with urgent news. "Sir, we've just intercepted communications between Detective Baker and known cartel members." They're getting nervous. They know something's not right about Thompson. The tension in the room peaked. If Baker and his partners started digging deeper into Thompson's background, everything could unravel. Years of careful work, dozens of ongoing operations, and countless lives would be at risk. Meanwhile, in the Internal Affairs Office, Detective Parker was having her own breakthrough. She'd been reviewing security footage from local businesses near previous arrests made by Baker and Reynolds. Something caught her eye. The same unmarked black SUV appeared in multiple videos, always just before their big arrests. "Look at this," she told her partner, freezing a frame that showed the SUV's reflection in a store window. A man in the passenger seat was clearly visible, making a phone call. She pulled up another image. A known cartel associate at a local coffee shop. Same person. Her partner leaned in closer. "So Baker and Reynolds are getting their tips directly from the cartel. But why would the cartel want to help cops make arrests?" "Unless," Parker replied, "the pieces finally falling into place, they're not helping cops, they're eliminating competition and threats." In his jail cell, Thompson was facing his own crisis. His public defender had just left after sharing the prosecution's full evidence file. They had surveillance photos that came dangerously close to revealing his actual CIA operations. If someone looked too closely at the timestamps and locations, he paced his small cell 6 steps each way, weighing his options. The CIA had protocols for situations like this, but they all assumed he could make secure contact. Here, every phone call was monitored, every visit recorded. Back at the CIA, Agent Rodriguez burst into Director Phillips' office. "Sir, we have a problem. Baker just requested a full background check on Thompson through federal databases. If he uses his cartel connections, he might access systems that could expose everything." Phillips grabbed his secure phone. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe less. The cartel has people inside multiple agencies. If they figure out who Thompson really is..." The director made a decision. "Get me the Attorney General. We need to move now." Meanwhile, Detective Parker was putting the final pieces together. She'd traced the mysterious SUV to a shell company, which led to another company, which connected to Greenlight Software, the same company that kept appearing in the background of Thompson's case. "Pull up Thompson's arrest report again," she told her partner. "Look at the location where they stopped him. 3 blocks from Greenlight's offices. That can't be a coincidence." As the sun set over Atlanta, all the players were moving into position. Baker and Reynolds were working late at the police station, making calls, pulling files, getting increasingly anxious as their background checks on Thompson hit mysterious dead ends. In the CIA Operations Center, teams of agents prepared for multiple scenarios. Some were posed as federal marshals, others as court officials. They had to be ready to move the moment Director Phillips gave the order. Detective Parker was also working late, unaware that her investigation was about to intersect with something much bigger. She'd just discovered that Baker had made several calls to a number that, unknown to her, was connected to the cartel's operations. Thompson lay on his bunk, appearing to sleep but actually alert to every sound. Years of training had taught him to recognize the signs of an operation reaching its critical point. Something was coming. He could feel it. Director Phillips stood in his office, looking out over the city lights. The next few hours would determine not just Thompson's fate, but the success or failure of one of the largest undercover operations they'd ever attempted. His secure phone buzzed. The Attorney General was calling back. The pieces were all in place. Baker and Reynolds were about to discover they'd accidentally arrested a CIA operative. The cartel was about to realize their carefully placed cops had made a massive mistake. And somewhere in the middle, Detective Parker was unknowingly holding evidence that could expose everything. The next 24 hours would change everything. The only question was, who would make the first move. The courthouse buzzed with activity on the morning of Alex Thompson's trial. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the wooden benches as people filed into the courtroom. Detective Baker sat confidently beside the prosecutor, while Officer Reynolds watched the door, seemingly more nervous than usual. Thompson's public defender shuffled her papers at the defense table, looking overwhelmed. She'd done her best with an impossible case, not knowing that everything was about to change. Thompson sat beside her, his face calm despite the circumstances. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Harrison entered the courtroom. The proceedings began normally enough, opening statements, the prosecution laying out their seemingly airtight case against Thompson. Baker took the stand first, testifying about the traffic stop and the discovery of drugs in Thompson's car. "And you followed all proper procedures during this arrest?" the prosecutor asked. "Absolutely," Baker replied, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. "Everything by the book." The public defender stood for cross-examination, but before she could speak, the courtroom doors opened. A well-dressed woman walked in purposefully, followed by two men in dark suits. She approached the bench, showing credentials to the bailiff. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I'm Director Brown from the Department of Justice. I need to speak with you immediately in chambers." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. It wasn't every day that a DOJ director interrupted a trial. "Court will take a brief recess," he announced, following Director Brown to his chambers. The courtroom erupted in confused whispers. Detective Parker from Internal Affairs, sitting in the back row, watched Baker and Reynolds carefully. Their confident expressions had cracked slightly. Reynolds kept checking his phone, while Baker's eyes darted between the chamber doors and the exit. Inside the judge's chambers, Director Brown wasn't alone. Director Phillips from the CIA had joined them through a side entrance. What followed was one of the most unusual conversations in the judge's career. 20 minutes later, the judge returned to the courtroom, his face noticeably different. "Clear the courtroom," he ordered. Everyone except the defendant, his counsel, the prosecutors, and the arresting officers. As the spectators filed out, more federal agents quietly entered, taking positions near the doors. Detective Parker was allowed to stay after Director Brown whispered something to the bailiff. "What I'm about to hear," the judge announced to the now quiet courtroom, "will be entered into a sealed record." He nodded to Director Brown, who stepped forward. "Your Honor," she began, "the defendant, known here as Alex Thompson, is actually a deep-cover CIA operative engaged in a critical national security operation." She paused as gasps filled the room. His mission was to track international drug cartels attempting to infiltrate Atlanta's technology sector. Baker's face went pale. Reynolds started to stand, but federal agents moved closer, encouraging him to remain seated. Director Brown continued, producing documents for the judge. "We have evidence that the arresting officers are actually working for the very cartel Mr. Thompson was investigating. Their arrest was not random. It was a deliberate attempt to disrupt our operation." The prosecutor looked stunned, staring at his case files as if they'd suddenly turned to sand. The public defender sat back, finally understanding why her client had remained so calm throughout the proceedings. Furthermore, Director Brown added, "Internal Affairs Detective Parker has uncovered significant evidence of Officers Baker and Reynolds' corruption." She nodded to Parker, who stepped forward with her own files. Thompson finally spoke, his voice steady. "Your Honor, with your permission, I can explain exactly how these officers have been helping the Valencia cartel eliminate their competition and disrupt federal investigations." The judge nodded, still processing the extraordinary turn of events. "Proceed, Mr. Well, whatever your actual name is." For the next hour, Thompson laid out the entire operation. He explained how the cartel had infiltrated local law enforcement, how they used legitimate tech companies as fronts, and how Baker and Reynolds had been crucial to their success. "The traffic stop that night," Thompson explained, "wasn't random. I was getting too close to exposing their entire operation. They needed to stop me, but they didn't know exactly who I was, just that I was a threat." As he spoke, federal agents quietly took positions behind Baker and Reynolds. Detective Parker added her findings, showing how the officers' arrest patterns perfectly aligned with cartel operations. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the growing pile of evidence on his bench. When the explanation finished, he sat back in his chair, taking a moment to absorb everything. "I've been on this bench for 20 years, he finally said, and I've never seen anything quite like this." He looked at Thompson. Case dismissed. Then he turned to Baker and Reynolds. "As for you two." The federal agents stepped forward, handcuffs ready. The courtroom watched in silence as the two officers were taken into custody, their badges removed. The perfect case they thought they'd built had just destroyed their careers and exposed a criminal conspiracy larger than anyone had imagined. 3 months after the dramatic courtroom revelation, the Atlanta Police Department faced its biggest shakeup in decades. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly appointed police chief's office as she reviewed the final report on the Baker Reynolds investigation. Detective Parker sat across from her, now wearing the badge of Internal Affairs Division Chief. The investigation uncovered 15 more officers involved in the corruption scheme, she explained, sliding over a thick folder. They weren't just taking bribes, they were actively helping the cartel maintain control over specific neighborhoods. The police chief nodded gravely. "And the tech companies." "The FBI has shut down 6 software firms that were acting as fronts for money laundering," Parker replied. Greenlight Software alone had processed over $300 million in cartel money through their consulting services. Meanwhile, in a secure federal courthouse downtown, Baker and Reynolds faced the consequences of their actions. The judge looked down at them from the bench, his voice firm as he delivered their sentences. "You've betrayed not just your badges, but the trust of every citizen you swore to protect," he declared. 25 years, no possibility of parole. As they were led away in handcuffs, Baker finally spoke up. "We never knew Thompson was CIA," he said, almost to himself. "We thought he was just another tech guy getting too close." Across town, the CIA's Atlanta operation had moved to a new location. Thompson, now using a different cover identity, sat in Director Phillips' temporary office discussing the aftermath. "The cartel's entire East Coast operation is in chaos," Phillips said, showing Thompson the latest intelligence reports. "When we arrested their police contacts, we also got access to their entire communication network. The evidence is leading to arrests across 5 states." Thompson nodded, thinking about his time in the county jail. Those 9 days were worth it then. "More than worth it," Phillips agreed. "But next time, try not to get arrested by corrupt cops." Back at police headquarters, major changes were underway. The new chief had implemented a comprehensive reform program. Every officer's past arrests were being reviewed for signs of corruption. Body cameras now had triple redundancy in their recording systems, and new oversight committees included civilian members. Detective Parker's office wall still held the evidence board from the Thompson case, now used as a training tool for new internal affairs officers. "This is what corruption looks like when you dig deep enough," she told her team. "It's not always obvious. Sometimes the most successful officers are the ones you need to watch most carefully." The public defender who had represented Thompson visited the station, now part of a task force reviewing potentially compromised cases. "We've identified over 200 arrests that might have been part of their scheme," she explained to Parker. "Each one needs to be reinvestigated." In the evidence room, technicians carefully cataloged years of seized drugs and weapons, checking each item against Baker and Reynolds' arrest records. Many would be revealed as plants, carefully staged to frame innocent people who had gotten in the cartel's way. The city's tech industry was also changing. Companies now faced stricter oversight of their financial transactions. The legitimate businesses welcomed the scrutiny. It helped prove they weren't involved in the scandal that had rocked their industry. 6 months after the trial, Thompson sat in a new office surrounded by different computer screens. His cover identity now had him working as a cybersecurity consultant, allowing him to keep watching for signs of cartel activity in the tech sector. Detective Parker occasionally crossed paths with him at the courthouse, neither acknowledging the other, but both knowing they were on the same side. The case had taught them both valuable lessons about appearances and justice. The police chief held a press conference on the steps of headquarters, addressing the reforms that had been implemented. "What happened in our department was a betrayal," she said to the assembled reporters. "But from this betrayal, we're building something better." Every officer now knows that wearing a badge means being worthy of the public's trust. In the back of the crowd, Thompson listened, wearing a simple business suit and blending perfectly into the background. His new mission was already underway. The cartels were still out there, looking for new ways to operate. But now they'd find it much harder to corrupt the system. The story became a turning point for the city, though few people knew the whole truth. For most, it was simply about corrupt officers facing justice. Only a handful knew about the deep-cover operative who had helped expose it all, or the complex web of international crime that had been disrupted. As the sun set over Atlanta that evening, Thompson drove home in an ordinary car, living an ordinary life, at least on the surface. The city was safer now, though new threats would always emerge. But that was why people like him existed, to work in the shadows, protecting a system that most citizens never knew was under attack.